All right, we're now entering the second week of news about the allegations that President Trump may have pressured a foreign government to go after one of his political rivals. And Republicans in Congress continue to remain largely silent about it. One of a few exceptions came from Utah Senator Mitt Romney, who said this to NBC News' Garrett Haake earlier today.
The allegations that were made in the press are quite serious, and the question now is what exactly did happen.
Do you need the transcript? Because the president has already admitted that he did have this conversation with Ukraine's leader, and that he did talk about the Bidens, and that he did, in effect, ask this foreign power to investigate one of his political opponents.
He said he spoke, mentioned Vice President Biden's name, but did not ask for an investigation. He did not say that. He may have, by the way. I just don't know whether that was, in fact, said by the president or not.
That was Mitt Romney talking to NBC's Jeff Bennett, not Garrett Haake. Senator Lisa Murkowski was similarly cautious today, telling Alaska Public Media that if the president used his influence to pressure Ukraine, it would be, quote, very concerning. Now, today, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell broke his silence on the issue, accusing Democrats of politicizing the whistleblower process in their attempts to shed light on the allegations.
It is regrettable that House Intelligence Committee Chairman Schiff and Senator Schumer have chosen to politicize the issue, circumventing the established procedures and protocols that exist so that committees can pursue sensitive matters in the appropriate, deliberate, bipartisan manner.
All right, when we come back, I'm going to ask conservative columnist Jennifer Rubin and Republican strategist Rick Wilson what it means for the Republican Party to remain silent on this issue and how long they'll be able to keep it up. Today, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham told conservative radio host Hugh Hewitt that America will be blown away by Donald Trump's transparency about his phone call with the Ukrainian president, where President Trump allegedly pressured the foreign leader to investigate one of his political rivals.
I would just urge the president, he's talking openly about the conversation, to release as much as possible. I believe that President Trump is going to blow you away with his willingness to disclose and be transparent about this phone call, because I think he did nothing wrong and he has nothing to hide. Get ready for some disclosures from the president that I think will exceed every expectation.
Getting ready for disclosures from the president that are going to exceed every expectation. Our conservative writer, Jennifer Rubin, an opinion writer at the Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. Also getting ready to be blown away is Rick Wilson, Republican strategist and a contributor to the Daily Beast. He's the author of Everything Trump Touches Dies. Jennifer Rubin. I mean, I'm just going to leave you to assess what Lindsey Graham just said. We're going to be blown away by the president's transparency and all the detail, and it's going to exceed expectation. That would be new.
Right. And then he's going to show that he really was concerned about criminality in other countries, and he really is a do-gooder, and on and on and on. This is nonsense, of course. One point that I think has to be stressed again and again, of course they were talking about Trump's political opponent, because if they were talking about the general interest of the United States, they would have sent the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, someone who worked for the government. Trump sent his private attorney to do private business for him. And this was it. Now that we have the other half of it, I think we're going to have a daily stream of leaks. I don't expect many, if any, Republicans to come out at this stage. But as we get the drip, 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 and as we get through the House process, you're going to see, I think, some very nervous Republicans, because I think what this newest revelation does is it shifts the political calculus. It is now much easier for the Democrats in 2020 to accuse Susan Collins, for example, of being a toady for a lawless president than it is for her to defend Trump as the victim of some kind of smear campaign. The same is true of Tom Tillis. The same is true of Cory Gardner. So the political incentive now for Republicans to flee is beginning to equalize their aversion to fleeing before. So I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing more and more little cracks. We saw a little tiny crack with Mitt Romney, but
little tiny.
Hey,
there was a lot of qualification there. There was a lot of
right.
ifing if it happened. Lisa Murkowski, if it happened, if it's true.
Right. But you know, let them put out the transcript.
Yeah.
But more importantly, let them put out the complaint, the whistleblower complaint, because that has more information, arguably, than just this one phone conversation. It apparently describes a whole pattern of behavior.
Rick Wilson, I called you a Republican strategist. Are you still a Republican strategist?
Not anymore. I mean, look, there's no Republican Party left. There's only Donald Trump's party, and it's a party today that has a bunch of people who used to be Republicans who are now, you know, having a competition to see which one can lick Donald's boots and give them the highest shine every day. But I think what we're really looking at here, I think Jennifer is right, there is some nervousness building now. And there are guys who are actually like cracking the old Wikipedia and looking back at what happened during Watergate. 1973, the Republican Party was screaming that it was a fake news conspiracy by the liberal media against Richard Nixon. 1974, 49 House members and 8 Senate members lost their seats. So I think they're starting to realize that maybe this guy who's a reckless day trading chode finally got out over his skis to the point where it's going to drag a lot more of them down with him.
So the reason I asked you the question is because on Meet the Press, you know, we've got a lot of information about what happened. I fully agree that one doesn't want to make decisions based on half the information, and it would be very simple, Rick, for the White House or the Justice Department to not prevent Congress from getting the necessary information, and as Jennifer says, the whistleblower complaint.
Sure.
But Chuck Todd was talking to Pennsylvania Senator Republican Pat Toomey. Let's just listen to what his response was.
I don't know what the conversation was.
I just told you. He said he did bring up corruption in Biden. I mean, was that appropriate under any level?
Again, I don't know the context. I don't know what was said. Look, it is not appropriate for any candidate for federal office, certainly including a sitting president, to ask for assistance from a foreign country. That's not appropriate. But I don't know that that's what happened here.
How long does that go on for, and how well does that work, Rick?
You know, I mean, the big thing here is these guys are a whole bunch of profiles in chicken blank right now because all of them are terrified that Donald Trump is going to tweet at them. They're terrified he's going to send up a mean video like he did to Mitt Romney tonight, a man who is demonstrably his better in every possible respect. And they're still living in fear of this guy, and they're willing to sacrifice their integrity and their political lives in order to not have him be mad at them. This is a cult that is governed by terror. So it's going to last until they start seeing their numbers take big hits. It's going to last until they start seeing that their polling is influenced by him. They should have known already. They lost 42 House members last time. They beat themselves on the chest saying, oh, we kept the Senate. Well, big deal. You lost 42 House members and about 350 other elected officials around the country. Donald Trump is a political cancer who is going to devour all of them.
Jennifer Rubin, from an entirely different perspective, there are a lot of Republicans, particularly men of a certain age like Lindsey Graham, who should perhaps be more concerned with the fact that we were dangling, taking away military aid from a country that is the front line in a battle with a Russia that is looking to spread itself as far as it will go. There's a military NATO world peace component to this.
Right. The old Lindsey Graham, who was a friend of the dear late John McCain, would have been outraged by this. Because, as you say, Ukraine is on the front lines. They're already being occupied in part by Russia. They are an ally of ours. This whole hullabaloo with Ukraine started when the West was attempting simply to establish trade and economic relations with Ukraine, which the Russians wanted no part of. So, yes, this has put our national security interests behind, oh, wow, again, Donald Trump's personal interests. And when you pile this on top of all the other instances in which he's put his personal interests ahead of public interests, whether it's escorting people to his hotels so he can advertise them, or whether it's some other act of public policy. This is a guy who is going to look after himself. We thought he was somehow Putin's debt? No, he's willing to switch sides. He's not even loyal to Putin anymore. He'll take any help from anybody he can get. So I think the Republicans are going to start running out of excuses as more and more of this comes out. What happens to Pat Toomey when the transcript comes out, when the whistleblower complaint comes out? Are they still going to stand behind him? Are they going to say, well, it doesn't say quid pro quo, or it doesn't say specifically Biden's name? There's going to be very little running room for these people to use, and eventually it's going to be closing in on them. And you know who else it's closing in on? Mr. Pence, Mr. Pompeo, anyone who was in his circle in foreign policy, anyone who met with the Ukrainian president recently. What about the head of OMB, Mick Mulvaney?
Mick Mulvaney, who was the one who sent the message.
The message about holding back the
money and
funds.
not being forthcoming, perhaps, with lawmakers about why the money was being withheld,
so
using the excuse that it was about foreign corruption.
I think that nudges us quite a bit more into sort of a conspiracy frame, where you've got a very loyal hatchet man of Donald Trump, who is willing to do something the State Department didn't want to do and DOD didn't want to do, but Mick Mulvaney went and found a shortcut through OMB so that Donald Trump would have the predicate in his extortion call to the Ukrainians. He would have the predicate saying, the money's on hold, too bad.
Mick Mulvaney was a Tea Party Republican who was all about accountability, who was all about Washington being run by a bunch of people who did not believe in Congress's authority. To suggest that you'll lie to Congress, you'll lie to Congress members to do someone's bidding because Donald Trump, your boss, is somehow very, very concerned with corruption in the developing world, or in Ukraine. That one's interesting to me.
Oh yeah. The transformation of Mick Mulvaney is one of the people that is the most marked in this entire process. He was a guy who went from being a constitutional conservative to being Mr. Trump is your car, have a high enough wax shine on it this morning. So it's a real disappointment to watch what's happened to him, but it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Jennifer Rubin, Rick Wilson, thanks for joining me tonight.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.